This episode is sponsored by Kendo UI. Kendo UI allows you to build better apps faster. They have a comprehensive library ranging from data grids and charts to buttons and sliders. Plus, you can use their components as plain JavaScript as well as in Angular, React, and Vue. They have a large collection of customizable popular themes like Bootstrap and Material. Go check them out at reactroundup.com/KendoUI.
Hello from New Orleans. This is React Roundup, and this week we're talking to Jordan Eldredge about his Webamp project. I am your host, Sia Caramelagos, and we also have Lucas Haish. Why don't you guys say hi?
I'm Lucas. Hello from New York.
And I'm Jordan. Hello from the San Francisco Bay Area, where it is currently 8 a.m.
I forgot about time differences. Yay, area. All right. So, Jordan, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? It looks to be pretty interesting.
Yeah, sure. So, my first introduction to programming was actually having to do with music, because I was studying music in college. So I had done a bunch of music things in high school, and when I decided I was time to go to college, the sort of natural thing was to study music. And so I got my degree in music. I studied opera and as an opera singer. And while I was at school, I was working on a side project. I was working on a few side projects, but the main one I was working on was actually a software for organizing my large collection of opera recordings. So I had gotten to the point where the iTunes ID3 tag sorting was not cutting it for tracking, who the conductor was and who the singers were and what roles they were singing. And so I was so frustrated that I figured I would write my own thing. And so I forced myself to learn PHP and MySQL, and I did all web because that was the only thing I knew how to do. I just continued working on that project and teaching myself things along the way. And when I graduated school without a useful degree and instead had no job, I was sitting on the couch, and my roommate at the time was doing contract work for small WordPress sites and projects like that. And he was behind on a deadline, and I was sitting there hacking on my side project with no job. And he's like, "Hey, do you want to do some of my work for me?" And I was like, "No, I don't want to do your work for you." He's like, "I'll pay you money." And I said, "Oh, that sounds like a good idea. I should do that." So I did that for a number of years. And eventually I realized I wasn't sort of growing in the way that I wanted to be growing, doing these small sites. And so I applied for a job at a startup, and a bigger startup. And I did that for a while. And that's sort of where I started to really learn real engineering. And so that's how I went from singer in college and continuing to do that here in the Bay Area to engineer.
That's pretty awesome. So have you recorded anything opera-wise?
I do mostly live stuff here in the Bay Area. I never really had the ambition to do it, or I guess a combination. I never really had the ambition plus the required natural extreme talent to do opera at sort of the very, very large scale. I continue to do sort of regional performances here. Opera is not so much a recorded medium right now, except at the very top level. So mostly just live performances.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I relate a lot to that because I also have a music background. I work as a musician for 15 years before. Although it was different, I was a keyboard player in more popular music settings, playing with bands and playing inside the studios, things like that. And I feel that it's a common thing in front-end developing. I believe that 90% of every front-end team I worked with, people were from really diverse backgrounds from everywhere, from music to a lot of design, people with design background and stuff like that. Why do you think that that's a thing in front end in particular and in programming in general?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting question. I think there might be two pieces to it. And of course, this is all conjecture, but I think part of it is that front end is really young. Front-end web development as a sort of mature discipline. And I think a lot of people who are self-taught probably came through the web because it's an open platform. I think dev tools and the browser made it very approachable to sort of like, view source, copy, paste, and you're on your way. So I think if you're going to be self-taught, it's probably much more likely that you're going to come in through the web, HTML, making websites for your friends. And so I wouldn't be surprised if there's a disproportionate number of self-taught engineers in front end. And then similarly, I think you're right that I think that front end engineers overlapping with the design world is also, so I guess it's sort of natural, right? That you would have people who were interested in design figuring out, okay, well, how can I go one step, to the right or to the left, I guess, depending on where you're standing, and figure out how I can be more helpful and implement some of these things myself or have more control. But I've definitely observed the same thing, that there is a pretty surprisingly large overlap between front-end engineers and specifically musicians. And I don't know whether there's more musicians in the world than I would have otherwise estimated, or whether there is sort of some correlation. But I don't know entirely why that is.
Yeah, I believe it's really hard to make money as a musician.
Everyone grows up with their ambitions of being a musician, and then looks around and goes, "Oh no, how do I make money?" And then engineering says, "Hello."
Yes, right. Yeah, and the web, I agree with you. Like the first time I opened Notepad, and I could in 5 minutes have a marquee with my name. Just going, I said, this is amazing.
That's actually so funny. So one of the we're here talking about Webamp, which is this reimplementation of Winamp in JavaScript, and one of the hilarious things that I actually got to do as part of this project was Winamp. So I guess for anyone who doesn't know, Winamp was sort of the canonical MP3 player from the late 90s, early 2000s, Napster era. But it had this sort of very unique UI. And one of the things that it featured was actually a marquee where it would have the title of your song, and it would be scrolling past. And I was so excited that I was going to get to use a marquee tag, a real marquee tag for its real purpose. And I was like, I'm going to do it. And then I realized very quickly that I couldn't actually use a real marquee tag because it had to jump letter at a time. Mm-hmm. Instead of being linear. Mm-hmm. And then also I had to be able to control it. So in certain instances, the way you interact with it, it has to be we have to scroll it manually. And so I had to drop and do it in JavaScript. So
that's sad.
I guess the marquee tag spec wasn't nearly flexible enough for the future cases that would come along.
Oh my God, that's a great story.
I know, that's really funny. So what did you originally write Webamp in? Yeah,
so the main inspiration for the project, so for anyone who doesn't remember, Winamp was themable, so you could download these binary files called skins.
I totally forgot about that.
Yeah, it was for me actually that was one of my main introductions to, I think, being constructive at the computer. Was trying to create these Winamp skins, and the only ones I ever did were the worst. They're terrible. Like Lucas was saying, people coming from design to front end. That was not me. It wasn't that I had some skill in design, but so I was This was shortly after I had started my job at a startup, and I was working on CSS sprites, which is this idea where you can instead of having a large number of very small images, you can put them all together in one single large image, and then you can use CSS to sort of slice them out into show just one piece of that sprite, that larger image. And I was doing that. Yeah, I think it's still an optimization for when you have a lot of small images. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so I was working on something like that for work, and I was sitting at home and I just realized that's the way we're doing that with CSS, which I think comes from video games originally, is really similar to how Winamp skins were made. I wonder if I could use CSS to render the Winamp UI from its original assets, from the original skin assets. And so I sat down to do that. And at that time, I really had done almost no real JavaScript. I had sort of like stitched together bad jQuery plugins. And so I reached for what I knew, right? I reached for jQuery. And so it was all DOM-based and it was all jQuery. And I worked on it for a while and it was fine. I got the original like rendering piece working. But I very quickly realized that I didn't really know what was going on. Like I had this sort of, I think anyone who's worked with a framework long enough realizes that, or who starts with a framework rather than starting with sort of the core language, goes to a phase where they realize that like, oh, there's something happening under the hood here. And sometimes it's coming back to bite me, but I don't know what it is. Mm-hmm. And so I decided that I would rewrite in vanilla JavaScript. And that I think was a huge like turning point in my career of like realizing like, oh, it's not that complicated. And I felt like a sort of a tautness between myself and the program I was writing, where I felt so much more in control of what I was doing. And everything sort of made sense in a new way. And that was really where I started to learn real JavaScript. And so, yeah, for a while it was written in vanilla JavaScript. And I was like, how do you write modules? Like, how do you separate code into different like files? I don't know how to do any of this. Like, how do you encapsulate things? And like, I think I had like 6 different notions of like what a class was, or like how do you encapsulate things? And then I added more and more and more functionality, and I started to realize that with a sort of like MVC style model, which I think was sort of what I was trying to follow, you end up ultimately, unless you're extremely careful, you end up managing transitions rather than managing state. And so like someone clicks a button, and especially when you end up with like state in the DOM, every click of a button has to figure out like, okay, from this state, how do I get to the new state? And from what I had read about React, which I really had done very little with at the time, I realized that it had the potential to sort of nip that in the bud, because I was ending up with this like exponential growth of code complexity versus features. So every time I add a new feature or a new state, I end up having to manage the transition between that state and every other state. And so you can see like this is an exponential growth and this code is not going to scale. But React had this model where, you have a one-way data flow of like state maps to UI, maps to HTML. And so I realized this is a much more reasonable paradigm for this particular project. And I ended up switching to React with Redux to model the state. And I think for this project, it ended up being an extremely good fit.
That's really interesting. So do you believe that the struggle with vanilla for a while made you like more aware of what React really brings? Because this is like, sometimes the boilerplate culture of like early React and things like that, people were like, oh, let's go directly to React and Redux, and then not understanding why those pieces are there. Do you think this gave you like a good...
Yeah, I think Dan Abramov has like his sort of a notorious blog post about like you might not need Redux, or you don't need Redux. And I think one of the things he calls out is like, don't start with a tool, like start without the tool until you feel the pain of not having the tool and then reach for the tool. And it's very tempting not to do that, especially, I think everyone sort of wants to be making sure they're keeping up and that they're trying all the new things. And I would totally agree, Lucas, that like from having felt the pain of what vanilla JavaScript didn't offer, and even before that, having felt the pain of of using jQuery and the ways that it was getting in my way or separating me from the like direct access and understanding of what I was doing. Getting that, having felt that pain, that I understood the problem that React and Redux were actually solving for me, without sort of like blindly applying it. And yeah, it definitely taught me a lot, just like how to write any code at all. But then I think also React was a great fit there, and Redux as well, in that they're built around the vanilla JavaScript as the main thing that you're doing most of the time. and everything that I learned before was how to map over things and how to do all these things transferred directly in a way that I don't know if moving to another framework would have been quite so direct.
Yeah, one question I would have about your choice of React is that when the Winamp application has a lot of like browser-specific APIs used, like audio and things like that are very like side effectful, and these things are a little bit tricky with React sometimes. So how did you deal with the audio API or something?
Yeah. So one of the things I love about side projects, and this, I've been working on this side project since like late 2014. So it's like a very long-term project for me. But the thing that I love about side projects is that there is not a deadline. And so when you get stuck, I feel like at work, it's like, okay, I'm stuck. I got to figure out how I'm going to hack it, or how I'm going to, how am I going to ship at the end of the week, or how am I going to ship today? And with the side projects, like, I don't have a good solution to this problem. I'm just not going to solve it. I'm going to wait a week, a month, 6 months, until I really feel like I have a good solution to this problem. And especially with the introduction of Redux and this sort of beautiful one-way data flow that Redux enables, I was really stuck with how to include the web audio into that, because so the audio itself has side effects, right? Like, it can stop on its own when you get to the end of the track. And so, like, if you want to have a single source of truth, how do you manage this other thing, which also has the reality of the world going on in it? And then I think even more complicated, the Webamp has this like visualization, right? Where as the audio is playing, you see a live like spectrograph of what the audio is doing, and that's like the updates that are way too fast to be going through. You're not going to have a dispatch in action, 60 times a second. And so I sat on this problem for a long time, not feeling like I had a good way to model it. And the solution I ended up coming up with, I think, really was a good one, which I ended up using a Redux middleware, which was basically the only thing in the application which knew about the audio source. And so it would subscribe to the audio node and listen for events like the playback ended. And it would listen for events like, the duration changed, or that we stalled, or that, all the different things that can happen as side effects in audio land. And it would dispatch an action when that happened. And then conversely, it would listen for actions. And anytime the play audio action would be dispatched, it would pass that back to the actual audio node. And so there was basically, I feel like the more I learn about software, the more the challenges are about taking all the ugly things and putting them in one place. And once you can do that, you don't feel so bad. Like, the rest of your application can pretend that the world is actually a great place and that there aren't side effects going on. But it was really just about finding a way to take all those different pieces that were leaking out into the rest of my application and putting them in a single place. And yeah, the Redux middleware ended up being a great way to do that. As far as the visualization, which does have to update much more quickly, that is one additional source of truth that I have. So there's the Redux state, and then the analyzer node, which I propagate through the Redux, the React tree, and components will subscribe directly to that to render to a canvas, things like that. But yeah, it was a very interesting challenge, and I was glad that I had the time to think about it, because it wasn't an obvious solution to me. In retrospect, it maybe seems kind of obvious, or maybe to a smarter engineer it would seem obvious, but to me it took a while to come up with that solution.
I think that's how we learn, though, right? Like, we do it wrong or hard, difficultly the first time around, and then we finally realize that this is crap, and so we find a better way.
Yeah, and I think
that's how we learn.
Yeah, and I think side projects are a great opportunity to follow up on those things where you learn oh, that is crap. And I feel like, at work, it's very hard to validate oh my gosh, I finally found the right solution to this thing. Time to go spend a week refactoring this and make it actually good. And people are like, yeah, but it works. And
Yeah.
We've got other features to ship, and we got, customers. We got to be creating value here. And with a side project, it's like, no, I don't care about creating value. I just want this software to be really nice. Yeah, I think that for me, at least, this particular side project and the other ones that I've had as well has really been a great teacher to me, because it has afforded me the opportunity to really have the space and the bandwidth to try to figure out how to solve problems the right way, even though, like you said, I often have to do it wrong several times before I get there.
Yeah. So it's really interesting. Yeah, I understand. Like in companies, when you are in a company, you don't have that time of like the next iterations a lot of time, because money will, right? You run out of money, so you can't say like, okay, let's try 5 times.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, you can't say let's try 5 times, and you can't say let's wait 5 months until you're taking a shower one morning and you're like, oh, a middleware, that would be a good solution.
Yeah, this is really, and maybe this is the source of the tech debt that we deal so much like in our lives, and then from time to time we can have the luxury of that refactory time, and then refactor and we solve those problems and create new ones for the future.
or even, this migration from jQuery to vanilla JavaScript to React. Who knows if I would have, in a more productized environment, if I would have felt, empowered to make that initial jump. It's like, well, we've got this, we're already going on jQuery. Let's just keep paying into that. And, at some point it's easier with a side project to say like, nope, let's just rewrite everything. Than it would be otherwise.
Yeah, there are a bunch of Backbone and Angular 1 projects out there, right, that people believe it's not worth like rewriting it on newer stack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, in fact, actually, when I was first working on Webamp, I was working at a company where we were basically all Backbone, which actually I think had that experience taught me a lot as well. And then we did start sort of doing new things in React at that company. And so I think a lot of the things that I took away, that I learned at work, then did also filter back into a side project.
Deploy more, pay less with DigitalOcean, the simplest all-in-one cloud computing platform for developers. Scale and run cloud applications faster and more efficiently with effortless administration tools to robust compute, flexible configurations, networking services, real-time alerts, and rapid provisioning, while enjoying industry-leading price to performance with a flat pricing structure across all global data center regions at any usage volume. Spend more time building better web apps and less time worrying about managing infrastructure with DigitalOcean. Build your next app on DigitalOcean. Get started with a free $100 credit at do.co/roundup.
I feel like it also teaches us why we don't always refactor on the job too, because we realize how long it actually takes once we dive in.
Yeah, definitely. And I think one of the things that I've taken away is that when you do go to refactor, that like the most important thing that you need is a strategy that is iterative, and that like a rewrite is almost never the right solution. In fact, I had a manager who was in one of our one-on-ones. He was telling me that about a study where they had basically analyzed a large number of software projects and looked at their like success or failure rate. Like basically, did they ever ship? And there was an enormous correlation between the size of the project and whether it ever shipped. And as your project gets larger, the likelihood that it's never going to happen is like goes up steeply. And so I think I've taken away from that, like it's better to take a long time and figure out a iterative path than it is to take the sort of what might feel like a shortcut and just rewrite. So even if it's much more painful to go iteratively, it's almost always a better solution. And that's what what I ended up doing myself actually through both of those migrations.
Very cool. So how did you approach that? For example, when you migrated to React and Redux, or I don't know if React was the first stage and then Redux later.
Yeah, I think I did I did React and Redux at the same time because I had some experience at work with those two together, and I felt like they would be a good fit. And yeah, it was basically just like one by one taking pieces of state which had lived in the DOM and migrating them into Redux. And I think I'm trying to remember now. I think I actually was doing. I was moving things into Redux and making sure that that was the source of truth. And then even if I had to like subscribe to the Redux store inside some, non or React code, that was for me, it was mostly about state, moving state out, and then adding React was easy. But first I moved state, and then if I had to manually subscribe to the store in like 30 different places, that was fine. Because at least the sort of source of truth was unified. And from there, it's very easy to rewrite in React.
That's very interesting. I've never even thought about, I guess because most React apps I start have been like the full app. Mm-hmm. So I never even thought like, yes, you can totally share the Redux store outside of React.
Yeah. That's another good point about side projects is I think most of us, we get a job at a company and we're working on an established application, and the process of creating a new application from scratch and all like the boilerplate and decisions that go into that are something that I feel like only a very few number of people at any one company actually get, because like 1% of the project consists of that, and the rest is almost always iterative on top of that and building this like tower taller and taller and taller. And so I think that figuring out how to start from scratch and figuring out how to migrate are both things that I don't know if I would have gotten on the job otherwise.
Yeah. Refactoring is such an interesting topic. I did Ruby before I did front end, and oh gosh, what's her name? Katrina Owens? I forget. But she had a really good talk at RailsConf about refactoring. Because I feel like we don't really learn good methods of doing it when we do need to actually do it, or if we're just doing it on side projects. But yeah, it definitely takes a higher level skill set to manage that without creating a huge mess.
Yeah. For the last years of my life, I've been working on like removing front end applications from a monolith and going to a new microservices kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And the first thing we need to think about when doing like any refactoring is like, how are we going to deliver, and how are we going to measure if this thing is working or not? So this is like, we always think like, oh, I'm going to use framework, blah, blah, and stuff. I have a lot of, before, like one step back, like how are you going to like cut that chunk of the application and put another chunk of another application there? And how are we going to know if it worked or not?
Yeah.
If it's better or not, and what do you mean by better, and what do you mean by, so all these like step backs, I believe that this is the most important. And even when you start thinking about that, parts of the solution start coming. One thing that I really like, and I believe it's an art and a science, is like, what's the size of the chunk? Because if you choose to be iterative in really big parts, we already know it's bad. But if you go really small, like let's say like a small piece of that form, it's impossible to get it right, and almost certain that it's gonna be a bad user experience. So how do you choose the size of the chunk that you were refactoring? This is also like a really interesting subject.
Yeah, I think the other thing that's interesting is when like feature work requires refactoring. So I had this one realization. So again, going back to these skins that Webamp has, or that Webamp supports. So like you can actually drag in any of these original skins into Webamp, and inside the browser we will like parse out all the images. We'll slice out all the images from the sprite sheets, and we actually end up converting that into a like enormous string, which is a CSS style sheet with like data URI images embedded in it and inject that into the DOM to get the styling. But what I realized is that in real Winamp, a skin is permitted to omit some assets if it wants to fall back to the default. And so I was like, well, how do I do this and like have a fallback? Like, how do I have two? Basically, I have to have like the default skin and the real skin. So this was like one of those cases where I was like, oh my gosh, the architecture that I've chosen doesn't work for this feature that I need to support. And so what I ended up having, realizing I would need to be able to do was have the initial skin basically loaded as a separate style sheet, and then new skins get layered on top. And I was able to use like the cascading nature and the like overriding nature of CSS to allow anything that hadn't been applied by the designated skin to fall back to the default skin. And so I was like, oh man, I'm going to have to like really figure out how to re-architect things. And so I ended up moving around a lot of different pieces to support this. And but the thing that was really interesting was at the end, because what I ended up doing was basically shipping the CSS piece instead of shipping the actual like the binary asset, and then like at load time converting it into CSS. And so this like project, which ultimately was like a refactor in order to support a feature, ended up realizing that the asset I was shipping was CSS instead of this binary blob. And once I had that, I was like, oh, well, now I could go like optimize the CSS. Like I could run all these data URIs through like a PNG optimizer. And if I don't actually have to parse the skin at startup, I don't have to like load JavaScript, fetch, and then like once I've loaded JavaScript, realize I need to make this AJAX request to get the skin file, and then run it through this like unzipping mechanism. So like I didn't need to wait for the JavaScript to load before I could start fetching the skin, and I didn't even need to load the zip utility as part of my default bundle. So I was able to defer loading that. And so this like new feature I had to add ended up requiring a refactor, and that refactor ended up actually like having this huge performance win for me at the end of the day. And I was like, that for me is like the most pleasing thing in the world, when like a new thing sort of completes your mental model of what the problem is in such a way that you realize that the problem is actually simpler, and that things can actually be simplified and made faster, rather than getting more complex. And I think, again, like a side project where you have the time to think about it, really is one of the few places where you I feel like outside of a side project, you might not be able to slow down enough to realize the bigger picture that, oh, this new feature actually completes a puzzle, which simplifies things rather than like adding another edge somewhere.
Yeah, interesting. I'm curious about another thing. You said that the application was evolving from jQuery to vanilla to React. And how did the configuration of your application evolve? Did it evolve? Are you using the same tools you were using in the beginning? How did it evolve?
Yeah, so I think, let's see, to make sure, there's I think a couple ways to interpret that question. Just from like a build process.
Yeah.
Like it went from having no build process with jQuery to just like a number of script tags, and like an increasing number of script tags, to vanilla JavaScript, still no build process. And then when I added React, I realized I did need to add a build process. And so, yeah, it's using Webpack. I still haven't upgraded to 4, but we'll see. We'll get there. But one thing that was interesting was once I was in Webpack land and I wasn't trying to solve, trying to split code up into different files for two different reasons, right? Because before having a bundler, I was thinking, okay, well, I need another file to encapsulate this logic, but that comes at the expense of an additional HTTP request. And like, what is the right trade-off here to make? And getting to basically separate those two concerns meant that there was suddenly an explosion of the number of files. So it's got like tons and tons and tons of files, whereas before it was sort of a smaller number of huge files. And I think that was a really nice thing to be able to do, without having to feel like I was compromising on another area. But it is a lot of complexity. It's surprising how much like fiddliness goes into a thing like having a build process in a bundler.
Yeah, I learned so much more when I didn't rely on Create React App, or actually I built a vanilla JavaScript project and had to start from scratch on Webpack. But this is, of course, before Webpack 4, where now they have sensible defaults.
Yeah.
But I learned so much about not just Webpack, but different, like every single performance piece, because you're basically building, your loader for each type of file. It was interesting, but yes, a little bit painful.
Yeah.
But you learn so much.
And it does sort of open the door for a lot of things like having, deferred loading and lazy loading. That was a huge, like I said, that was one of the big wins for this moving to this new architecture was I didn't need to have this entire zip library loaded as part of the initial load time. But one thing that did highlight for me is that I feel like there's not really a great story around dependencies which might want pieces of the dependency to be lazy loaded. So like one of the things that Webamp does is it will like if you drag in an MP3, it will read the ID3 tags. I guess this kind of goes full circle back to like my college days where I was rebelling against the like media tags in MP3 files and trying to like solve that problem. But now full circle, I'm like reading ID3 tags in a browser using actually a library that a colleague of mine, JS Media Tags. But one of the challenges is like, okay, I can lazy load JS Media Tags only when I actually need to read an ID3 tag. But for example, there's a guy on GitHub right now who's working on switching out that library for another one which can read a huge number of different media types. And I don't know if there's a great story for him being able to define like, hey, we only need to lazy load the reader for this data type when we get that type of file. And it's like these like transitive lazy loading. I don't feel like there's a good story for that. I don't know if there should be, right? Because maybe the lazy loading decision should be bubbled all the way up to the actual application level, but it's something that has been a little bit interesting and frustrating. And then also I want people to be able to include Webamp in their project. I mean, it's sort of a novelty. I don't think there's anyone who has a really useful use case for it. I mean, I guess the whole project is the novelty and doesn't have a real use case for it. But I want to have these transitive dependencies. I don't want to force anyone who wants to use my project to load everything up front. But right now I have to, because there's not really a good way for me to give them the opportunity to defer loading just by offering an NPM package.
When you first started working on this project, how did you tackle just the entire, because like when you think of a side project, I feel like some people don't get started because they just don't know where to start. So, because it's like you see your end product, but it's like, what should I actually build? I can't build it all at once. So how did you kind of manage that?
Yeah, so Winamp it was split into 3 main windows. There's like the main window, which has like play, pause, volume, and the track, and a little tiny visualizer. And then there's an equalizer, which lets you toggle like the bass and the treble, and that all works now. And then there's a playlist, which lets you, or sort tracks, and you can drag and drop, and you can, select and unselect and rearrange and whatnot. And again, my original interest was mostly in this idea of skinning. And so I just started with the main window and I got that working. And then I was like, oh, well, we should actually be able to play audio. Let me go learn about Web Audio API. And then I hooked up the bare minimum and I didn't have the visualizer or anything like that. And I posted it on Twitter. And I tagged like one friend of mine who I thought like, oh, this guy will get a kick out of it. And it ended up getting like retweeted like a bajillion times and got posted on Hacker News and then got like written up in like Gizmodo. And I was like, okay, there's something here. So I'm going to keep working on this. And yeah, from there I was like, okay, well, how do I get the visualizer to work? And let me learn about Canvas and analyzer nodes and web audio. And so it was very just like starting with like the very minimum thing that was interesting to me. Because the thing that was interesting was the skins. But then it was interesting how each additional step had this sort of exponential complexity growth, because the first window, okay, that's fine. Okay, now I want to add the second window. Okay, well now like you have to be able to drag windows around, and like they have this snapping feature where like you can put them next to each other and they'll like click. And like that was a huge problem to have to solve even before I could even start working on the reality of like how do you build an equalizer and how do you process the audio for that. And then again, like I did another announcement after that of like, oh, now we support the equalizer. And then from there with the playlist, it's like, oh my gosh, my whole, again, going back to refactoring, right? Like my whole architecture assumes there's only ever one track at a time. And so like, oh my gosh, everything has to be rewritten now to have this idea of like multiple tracks. So I think, maybe I kind of got lucky in that there was sort of this natural division into 3 parts, and that by picking only the first window, I didn't have to solve, window management. And by not picking the playlist, I didn't have to solve multiple tracks. And that did help a lot. But I think really it was about deciding what was interesting to me. And it was like, and sort of proving that out. And I think that was sort of my guiding light. But it isn't easy, especially in a project that is going to be large. In fact, in this project, I didn't know it was going to be large. I didn't realize that I would actually, almost 4 years later, that I would still be working on it.
And that people would look at it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Much
like other than your mom.
Right. Exactly. Or other than, like my one friend on Twitter who I was like, he's going to think this is the response to it has been pretty incredible. And I think, it really, if I have any advice for anyone, it's like ride the coattails of some other project that people already love. Because the nostalgia that this has managed to tap into for people, obviously I think it's a cool project. And I think that some of the, to get these things working in the browser was, pretty, some interesting problems. And I think it is surprising to see it in the browser that it works to the extent that it does. But really, I think the main purpose it's like ended up fulfilling is like nostalgic nerds being like, oh my God, I remember, when I was like in college or high school and like hacking on skins and like downloading, Metallica MP3s or whatever.
Yeah, I also like the idea of having like a definite set of requirements. Like it's the requirements, right? You have the application, it needs to have the same behavior. So this is interesting too. Like as a side project, you have like a clear objectives and clear like things that you need to accomplish.
That has been so freeing in this project. I feel like any project, no matter how well spec'd, the engineer ends up making these like millions of little micro decisions that affect like, oh my gosh, like, okay, when this button isn't clicked, but you click it for the first time, like, should it have its selected state? Or like these little things, which like, there are too small of details for design to really end up like having to spec out. Having everything just like, I'm going to free myself from the requirement of having to make decisions and judgment calls and just be like, this is the thing I'm building and I'm building it exactly like this. In fact, there are places where I've re-implemented bugs that Winamp had because that to me was more interesting than trying to decide like, what is the better thing? Like this thing is an audio player in the browser. No one's using it for like a real application. I'm free to make it a perfect re-implementation rather than making it like an actual useful thing. And I think you really hit the nail on the head that having being free from having to make any of those micro decisions and just code and just be like, just make it work like that. Cause that's hard enough, right? There's enough challenge there in trying to get it working without having to decide. But then on the flip side of that, some of these things are really hard to get working. And if I had been making, balancing like, how do I implement this? And is it the right thing to build? I'm sure I would have made a different decision. I would have been like, that seems really hard. Let's actually not have it do that. And I think that's sort of the flip side of the coin where it really forced me to like solve problems which I otherwise would never have, figured out how to solve or forced myself to figure out how to solve. And so I really think that this idea of re-implementing another application is really fertile ground for anyone who wants to learn. And it's something that you see in music all the time, right? Like covers, like a cover band or like covering other people's songs is like a completely like natural part of music, or like, you see people at a museum like sketching the great masters. Like this is a thing that you see all the time in other like crafts. And I think it's kind of interesting that it feels so absent from software.
Right. This is very interesting. Like that's how you develop real skills in, at least in popular music. It's like, I'm going to play exactly like this album and I cannot cut corners. It needs to sound exactly like that. So,
and that forces you to understand what it took to make that sound in that studio at that time, even if you're never going to be that exact person. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting place, and I would love to see more people take on projects like this, and because I do think you can learn an awful lot.
Yeah, it's so awesome. I guess, do we have any last questions or topics right before we go into our picks?
I'm good.
All right. So if there's no more questions, let's just go to our picks.
Do you run your own freelance business? Or maybe you're thinking about picking up some business on the side? Well, then you need FreshBooks. FreshBooks is the quickest and easiest way to get invoices out to your clients. It's easy to use. It works anywhere, available from any device on the desktop, iPhone, iPad, Android, and all of your data is backed up and secure. And it makes it really easy to get organized and get paid. You'll be tracking time, logging expenses, and invoicing your clients in no time. You can also save time billing, freeing up several days per month to focus on the work that you love, and you get paid faster. FreshBooks customers are paid on average 5 days faster because there's a link on the invoice that says pay me now. And it's a great way to grow your business. Plus, FreshBooks is offering a 30-day trial. That's right, 30-day trial if you try them out. So go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section. Once again, for a 30-day trial, go to gofreshbooks.com/devchat and enter devchat in the How Did You Hear About Us section.
For me this week, I'm going to do a pretty basic one, but someone emailed me a Word document earlier this week, and I realized how much I love Google Docs. Life easier when you need to edit or work on something with someone or collaborate. It's just amazing. Years later, it's still amazing.
It is.
All right, Lucas.
So this last weeks, I experimented with timing applications applications that time everything that you do in the computer as a productivity, self-discovery thing. It feels really creepy at first, but as long as you are doing it for yourself, for self knowledge and stuff, I believe it was really, really useful to understand how much time you're spending on each things that you have the intention to do. I was using the one called Timing app, which is, I believe it's Mac OS only, but I'm pretty sure there are lots of different ones for different platforms. So my pick this week is use a timing app for a while, and you will discover a lot about your own way of working and things like that.
That is a great recommendation. I keep meaning to do that, but I keep putting it off. I have a few picks. I've scrambled up here. One of them is, I guess, the self-promotion. So as part of this project, one of the things I realized was that one of the few pieces of actual value it provided was bringing Winamp skins, making them accessible again without having to go install, find an instance of Winamp and maybe even find Windows machine, now that I think a lot of us are using Macs. And so I at someone's suggestion on Twitter, I created a Twitter bot called @WinampSkins, which just periodically will tweet out a picture, this image screenshot of a Winamp skin, which is actually generated using Puppeteer and Webamp. So I can feed in an arbitrary skin and it will spit out an image, and then a link to Webamp with that skin loaded. So if you want a daily dose of nostalgia in your Twitter timeline, check out @WinampSkins. The other one is, if you are still interested in Winamp, it's the people who officially own it have pretty much abandoned it. But one of the original developers of Winamp, who was actually very helpful to me in my process, he was able to answer a bunch of questions for me about when I was working on Webamp. He's maintaining a project called Winamp Community Update Pack, which is abbreviated WACUP, WACUP, Winamp Community Update Pack, which is basically his Patreon sponsored fork of Winamp. So even though it's not open source, he's able to do some microcode patching and use its plugin architecture to ship a continually updating version of Winamp. So if you have Winamp nostalgia and you're man, I wish Winamp hadn't died, it hasn't died as much as you think it might have. So yeah, check that out. It's a really cool project, and there's a cool community of people around that. And then finally, there's a cool website if you like Webamp and those kinds of projects that are pushing the boundaries of the web and also are just kind of silly and don't necessarily have, they're not a product, they're just someone's hobby project. There's a really cool website called inspiring.online, which is just a blog of really cool stuff on the internet. and it's maintained as a Git repo on GitHub. So if you want to like submit something, you can just open a pull request and add it there. I guess like full disclosure, I found out about it because they had posted about Webamp. But yeah, it's a really cool website, and I feel like all the cool stuff on the internet shows up there first. So I would really recommend checking out inspiring.online.
Very cool. Well, thank you, Jordan, for telling us about Webamp this week. We really enjoyed the conversation. It's a lot of fun. And to our audience, thanks for joining us, and be sure to check us out next week on React Roundup.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CACHEFLY.com to learn more.